What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Warhammer 40k Chaos Gate Daemonhunters, which is an absolute mouthful of a name. But that said, just to get the usual stuff out of the way right at the beginning, I review games after 100% to set me apart from other reviewers on YouTube and lend myself some credibility. My Steam profile is public and linked in the description below. You are welcome to check it out. And while achievements are absolutely included in these reviews, they are not the only measure by which 100% is reached. So if you click on my channel and you're not subscribed, the very first video you'll see at the top is a video of me explaining everything that I cover in these reviews. But with no further ado, let's properly jump into this thing. This is a AA tRPG, which is a tactical RPG from the developer Complex Games. Now, I do want to mention at the beginning of this review, as I mentioned in my impressions video, which I usually start these reviews off with, is that I was not wildly familiar with Warhammer 40k lore or the universe, really. And just from playing this game, I do think it's worth mentioning that I'm not exceedingly more knowledgeable, though I definitely learned a lot. And in a situation like that, in my opinion, I basically have two options. I can read up on absolutely everything, or I can just approach the review from the perspective of someone not familiar with this setting, which in and of itself I feel like is a fairly unique perspective, so it's the one I choose to run with. But first and foremost, let's talk a little bit about the story setup for Chaos Gate. We play as the Grey Knights of the Imperium of Man. The Grey Knights, and all Space Marines apparently, are genetically modified soldiers that are used to fight in the various wars of the Imperium of Man, which is basically the faction of humanity. The Imperium of Man seems to be filled with mostly religious zealots, and the Grey Knights in particular are apparently very adept with psychic powers, which allows them to fight demons. Very early on in the game, our commander actually gets killed, and we are assigned command of the Baleful Edict, which is the ship that we're running. And we use this ship to effectively wage a campaign against what is called the Bloom. Soon after we take command, we are interrupted by Inquisitor Vakir, who demands that we investigate a plague that is going on, and naturally this leads to a bigger situation. But while I'm not going to be spoiling the rest of the story, that's just sort of a plot setup for you, there are a few things in general I want to talk about with the story. Overall, I would say that it's good. It's not particularly amazing or anything. However, I did learn a lot about the Warhammer 40k in the meantime, which I think is a positive in and of itself. That said, I will say while the story itself does take itself very seriously, there are aspects of the game that feel a little bit silly. Now, from my impressions video, a lot of people told me that that's kind of Warhammer 40k in a nutshell, which seems to be the case. Everything just has this sort of over-the-top aesthetic to it, so that seems about right. However, I do think it's worth mentioning that it does create a bit of a juxtaposition against the rather serious story taking place and the rather almost comical presentation at times that you are given, and it kind of fluctuates back and forth between those two things. And the other thing that I want to mention about the story is that actual story progression is spaced out, if you will, by research that you have to perform in between your missions. Days are passing in-game, and you'll have to do research about various things, which then gives you the information, which then helps you proceed with the story. And overall, I'm not wild about how that works. It reminds me of the power system in Dragon Age Inquisition in a lot of ways, in that you have to go gather up power, but in this case, you just have to research something, and it's basically a way of artificially padding the time out when I feel like instead you could have spent that time just writing more story. But we will double back to that point shortly, but first let's talk about a few other things. Now first up, the difficulty of this title. This is a tRPG, and as with most of these games, you'll pick a difficulty right at the beginning of the game. And that's important because this cannot be changed later. Once you pick a difficulty for a campaign, that's the difficulty for the rest of it. You can pick from Merciful to Legendary. Merciful, the enemies will take a benefit, you'll get some bonuses, and then Legendary is much harder, wounds take longer to heal, that type of stuff. Now, having played this on several difficulties, I can tell you that for me, as someone who plays a lot of these style of games, Normal was not really much of a challenge. I kind of just rolled over it outside of the last couple of fights. The last few fights were a decent challenge, but on Normal mode, most of the game was quite easy, at least for me, an experienced person with these games. The Legendary difficulty was much harder and required a lot more planning and strategy, from what missions I was undertaking to the knights I was using for them, and there was just a lot more of knowledge and pre-planning required. So overall, I think the difficulty scale was pretty good, and I would say normal is, if anything, a little too easy if you have a lot of experience with these types of games. But from there, let's talk world building a little bit. Now, I mentioned that you were in charge of a ship known as the Baleful Edict, and this is what you'll be using as a sort of command center for your campaign against the Bloom, or the plague that is happening. Now, this is where a decent amount of strategy actually plays into the title, because you're going to have to fly this ship around, your star map, if you will, and fight off various missions against the Bloom. This will require you to upgrade your ship, research the story progression like I mentioned, as well as researching stratagems and other buffs. There are also multiple upgrades to the ships that can expand how many knights you can have, how fast your ship is, how well you can defend your ship in the random encounters that you can find on the star map. And there is a decent amount of strategy layered on top of the tRPG here. So with the random events in particular, I did want to mention that sometimes in random events, or if you run into an enemy ship on the star map, your ship will be damaged, or there will be a random event to decide if it's damaged, and from there you actually have to repair your ship. So keeping your ship in good shape is part of this, in addition to all the upgrades that repairing your ship can give you. But one of the more important things is kind of just the speed of which everything is happening. So you can upgrade your ship speed to make it move around the map faster. You can also get prognosticators, which are sort of telepaths, best I can tell, that kind of figure out the general lay of the land and what's happening. And these will actually slow down the bloom timers, if you will, on each mission. Because every so often, as the days advance, missions will pop up in sort of a series on the star map, and then you have to use your starship to go tackle each one of them. However, if you take too long, these missions will be deemed successful by the enemy and then disappear from the map, while simultaneously increasing that planet's corruption level. The higher a planet's corruption level is, the harder the missions on that planet will be. So the difficulty in terms of the missions is usually decided by what mission is happening on what planet. And I would say this is specifically designed in a way where you can get to most of the missions, but some of them will ultimately be successful, causing the prevalence of the bloom to slowly creep up over the course of the game. The bloom corruption itself has levels of 0, so none, or up to level 5. At level 5, a bloom mission will instead turn into a flowering mission, meaning at this point, the bloom has done what it's meant to do on that planet and attempts to open a chaos gate. If this is successful 5 times, you automatically lose the campaign. These chaos gate missions, you do get the opportunity to stop them by going to the flowering mission, but if you fail, a chaos gate is opened, because you can fail these missions and the game will continue. It just counts it failed, like all the other instances for missions that you simply couldn't get to. But if you fail these Chaos Gate missions, there are serious consequences. But these Chaos Gate missions are very, very difficult, and you're better off just never letting a planet get to that point if possible, as the flowering missions are very, very stacked against you. But overall, that forms the bulk of the game. You'll primarily be going on these sort of procedurally generated missions against the infected, if you will, carrying the bloom, trying to do their thing, and spread their plague. And then, in the background, between you doing these missions, you'll be researching, which will then give you the information needed to progress the story, which gives you the more tailored and curated missions that form the actual bulk of the story. And I would say one of the key things I don't like about this overall is actually these sort of procedural missions. There's only so much variety they can really put into these things. And while we're about to talk about combat here in just a second, I think the lack of variety is one of the main things that hurts this title. Because the actual curated missions, if you will, for the main story are quite good. They mix up your combat encounters, there's some really cool bosses, there's a lot of tactics to those fights that go on, and you have to mix up your strategy, and again, they're quite good. Whereas the procedural missions are very straightforward. It's usually kill these specific enemies, defend yourself against some waves afterward, and then you're teleported out. And because of that rather simple mission structure, due to, I would imagine, the procedural nature of them, they're very easy to cheese. In fact, right before we jump into the combat section here, one of my main strategies for this game is that you could just stack action points on a character, as this game uses a turn-based action point system. And because of that, the action economy is king. So there are a variety of methods using some of the classes, etc., which will allow you to stack action points onto a character, and if that character is well outfitted, they can basically wipe out the enemy in like a turn or two, before the enemy even has a chance to move. And there was only a handful of fights in the game that method didn't work on, and those missions are typically the curated missions with the boss fights and the tactics, etc. that mix everything up. But with that said, let's actually talk about the combat a little bit. As I mentioned, turn-based action point system. There's quite a bit to it, however. You will have up to a potential 20 knights. You will typically take 4 of them with you on a mission. However, you can take less. There's a couple achievements for doing that. And these individual Grey Knights can actually be equipped with certain types of equipment, different weapons, different armor. You can actually customize the visual appearance of the knight and their armor individually, which I thought was pretty cool, and honestly helps separate them as they all kind of look the same. In addition to this, there are 8 classes available to these knights. 4 of them are the base classes, and then there are 4 advanced classes. Now, unfortunately, you don't actually progress their classes into advanced classes, but rather through a variety of means throughout the game, which the game gives you to recruit more knights as you play if any of them happen to die or get sent back to your homeworld, etc., or just lost through a random event. There are methods to generate more knights for you, and it is possible to get knights with the advanced classes, and that's pretty much the only way to get them. And I think simply because of this acquisition method, the advanced classes, in my opinion, were all a bit underwhelming, frankly. But that said, each individual class in terms of the base and its corresponding advanced class did feel overall pretty unique. There's the Justiciar, which can act as a support or a good melee damage dealer. There's the Interceptor, which has a teleport ability, which gives them a ton of mobility. There's the Purgator, which is a great ranged weapon specialist. They can deal a lot of damage that way and guarantee criticals. And then there's your healer class, the Apothecary. And then each of those has a corresponding advanced class, like I mentioned. In combination of those things, though, there are even more layers to the combat. We have stratagems. In addition to story progress, you can research stratagems via your ship. This will give you options that you as the player can activate by clicking a menu in combat to just activate various things for your knights to use in combat. Some of them can give you just flat out more action points, affect your movement. There's a lot of stuff here, and I think it adds a certain tactical layer, but I found that one of the best ones was the one given to you first, which was just give a character more action points. But we're not even done yet, because in addition to these things, there's a certain amount of interactivity with the environment that your characters can take advantage of by shooting statues, etc. You can cause them to fall on enemies, dealing a lot of damage and bypassing their armor. Armor in this game is a point-for-point damage reduction, so for every point of armor that you have, you will reduce the enemy's damage by that amount, and they have to get through all of your armor to damage your health, and your armor regenerates every turn unless they use an ability that has armor break. Which brings me to criticals. Criticals in this game are very important. There's a few ways to guarantee criticals, which is a very effective way to play the game, but criticals allow you to do a lot of things. Extra damage, or potentially other effects, such as disabling an enemy's abilities altogether, like their melee or their ranged attack. You can pick armor piercing in some cases, which will allow you to just bypass their armor completely. And criticals in this way can take a very challenging fight, say against a boss, and make it quite easy by simply disabling some of their stronger abilities. Now, I will say in the case of certain boss fights, I'm not sure if this is a bug exactly or if this is intended, but oftentimes with the bosses, even if you choose the disable this option, the boss will still then use it anyway. And again, I'm not sure if that's intended because it's a boss or if it is actually a bug and it's supposed to not work that way. But I did notice that sometimes that doesn't work on bosses. But nonetheless, pretty big part of combat. Now, broadly speaking, I think the combat is a lot of fun. And I think the combat is fun enough that it largely saves it from the procedural nature of most of the missions. Combine that with the fact that it's relatively easy to learn and has a good amount of depth, and I think you've got a relatively beginner-friendly tRPG, which is fantastic. Because also, as a veteran, I enjoyed it a great deal. And on top of that, the game does actually have a great tutorial for teaching you the basics of the system, which you can then extrapolate on as you play the game. So in terms of the difficulty and the combat, I think this game nailed it, which is incredibly important for a tRPG. Now, I do know that said, there was some tuning and balancing around some of the classes after this game released, so your mileage might vary in that particular regard. However, I personally thought it was well done. But that said, that's pretty much all there is to Chaos Gate, so let's talk positives, negatives, and draw a conclusion. So positives, for me, the actual combat was quite good. However, I did have a complaint about the lack of variety in terms of the enemies you're fighting and the nature of most of the procedural missions. The tailored curated stuff was quite good, and the actual combat was also quite good, but if anything, I do think it lacks a certain amount of variety, which is more of the negative portion. Other positives are, I think, the setting. I think, at least for me personally, as someone who didn't know a lot about Warhammer 40k, this was a really cool way to explore the concept in a way that is very friendly to how I like to play games. Other positives, I enjoyed the voice acting a great deal. There's only a handful of characters that you really hear talk throughout the game, but I think all of it was quite well done. And then the last positive I've got for you was the boss fights. The boss fights were all very cool. There's a handful of them throughout the game, as you might imagine, but all of them have kind of unique mechanics. Some of them will destroy the environment around you. Some of them have to be disabled. There's one that you have to find ways to critical because it's the only way it'll take damage. And I liked these fights because whereas the rest of the game I was able to just kind of walk through with one strategy or another, the bosses really required careful planning and like, what party am I taking into this fight type of situations, which I thought was a nice change of pace. In terms of negatives, I am not wild about the way the story progresses, the research thing. I would have preferred they just wrote more story missions than do it this way. I can see for the structure of their game why they went this way, but I'm not a fan of it. Another negative is that you are, while in a mission, always in turn-based combat, even if you are not actually in combat. So while you are in between fighting enemies and you're just moving along the battlefield, you're still doing that in turn-based, which is incredibly slow. Not a big fan of that. I wish it would just exit the sort of turn-based battle mode that you're in while you're not actively engaged with enemies, which would speed up the game a great deal. And as I mentioned, the lack of variety is of course also a negative, as you're going to be fighting a lot of the same stuff with the same strategies outside of the bosses. Last but not least for the negatives, the UI. I know I didn't really talk about it up to this point, but the UI is very busy and hard to read in my opinion. And while you do get used to it after a while, I think there is a certain amount of visual clarity that UIs require, and this UI is just very busy, and most of what is going on with the UI is not useful. And at least in the first hours of playing the game, I spent a lot of time being like, what is happening with this UI? There's just too much going on. In that regard, while all the options are there, I just wish they would clean up the visual presentation of this UI a bit. Which I get, Warhammer 40k, it's supposed to be over the top, whatever, but like the UI still needs to be readable. In conclusion, Warhammer 40k Chaos Gate Daemonhunter is a fun game. It's beginner friendly, but more than anything, it needs more variety. While this is a good game, I got quite a bit out of it. I think that this could be a great game if they fleshed it out a little more and added some more variety to these encounters. And because of that, $45 is pushing it for me, especially for a tRPG. Because $45 is the base price for this game on Steam, and while that is what I paid for it, and I, for the most part, feel okay with that price, I personally feel like I got my $45 out of it, but like I said, it's right on the edge. So if what I've said in this review doesn't sound compelling, I would probably go ahead and wait for a sale. But if what I've said also sounds good to you, then I do think it's worth the $45 in that regard. And again, me personally, I feel good about having paid $45 for this. I feel like I got my money out of it, but it's right on the fence either way. All of that said, guys, there you go. There's my review of this game with a ridiculously long title, so I'm not going to say it again. But I hope you enjoyed the review. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.